I'm going to talk about the courts, about the Supreme Court and judges and reapportionment, which is all balled up into the same thing. So let's all go back to, almost 60, 65 years ago when Earl Warren was appointed as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower had been elected in 1952. He was a former general who led us through World War II successfully. He was a great American hero. And by all accounts, by the way, really a reasoned, good guy who was able to knit the coalition together during World War II of different countries and so forth. And anyway, we won. And in 1952, Eisenhower himself was elected president. Now, in getting the nomination and getting there, Eisenhower had promised Earl Warren the next appointment to the Supreme Court. He didn't bank on Fred Vincent, who was the Chief Justice, suddenly dying and leaving the Chief Justice position open, and he didn't really want to appoint Warren as Chief Justice. But Warren grabbed around and said, a deal's a deal, and Eisenhower, being an honorable man, put him on the court. Now, who was Earl Warren? Earl Warren had been Republican governor of California, a relatively conservative guy. He ran in 1948 as vice president along with Tom Dewey. And Dewey was widely expected to win that race. He didn't. Truman won it. And so, in any case, in 1953, Earl Warren becomes Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he gets busy. Soon enough, we have the Brown versus Topeka, which integrates the schools in 1954, and a whole series of things. But we're really coming down to the 1962 Baker versus Carr. And in Baker versus Carr, it was arose out of Tennessee. And Tennessee, by 1960, had not reapportioned its congressional districts since, I think, about 1900. And so the urban areas had grown, and the rural areas were still modest in terms of their population. And so there was an imbalance here of, and you could argue, and I think fairly correctly, that the urban areas were underrepresented and it just wasn't fair. So in 1962, the Supreme Court decides to get involved and to tell Tennessee that you must reapportion, and you must do so every 10 years. And I think that's where the one-man, one vote came from. And so that's when, if my recollection serves me correctly, the U.S. Supreme Court waded into what up at that point had been clearly stated in this, and probably in the Constitution too, as I recall, the right of states to determine who represents them and what the portion, how its congressional districts are going to be set up. Well, it was a short trip from there to the courts then beginning to say, well, you don't have enough blacks in one district, and you don't have too many. And so began getting all involved in apportionment and reapportionment in states. And the purists here, and I'm not really a purist on states' rights, but there is wisdom in letting the states go ahead and muddy around for a while and find their way without the big foot Godzilla of the federal government coming down and going, you're going to do this. Because the courts these days are telling justices on many different levels are going in and telling states what to do. My favorite on this was a federal judge out in Kansas City many years ago who didn't like the way that the Kansas City school districts were conducting themselves, and said that, there wasn't enough money and so on. So while the people of Kansas City voted not to raise their taxes, the federal judge said, you will raise your taxes, and they did raise their taxes. And as I recall, that one drained all the other school districts through the state of Missouri, putting them under a certain financial duress. One guy, one judge. And by the way, any results that came from all that money washing into the Kansas City school district was not shown in statistics later on to have made much difference, if any, at all. So these days, what we have is President Trump does something or proposes something, and immediately in rides a federal judge from somewhere, and sometimes several somewheres, and says, hey, you can't do that, and they enjoin them and so forth. So far, President Trump and his administration have abided by the court decisions. Now, I've also heard from people who say, well, Biden didn't abide by the immigration laws, which were very clear, but Trump is abiding by the federal courts so far. Well, now we have Texas, which is reapportioning itself to pick up maybe as many as 5 seats. California has rescinded a law which brought a certain organization to California apportionment, which has now been thrown out. So California is going to probably pick up close to maybe a equivalent streets in Kansas City. Indiana is getting involved. Missouri is getting involved. And of course, the courts are getting involved and saying that Texas can't do what it's doing, and they're looking the other way on. Now, a while back, I began making note of when a justice, when a federal judge made a ruling, enjoining or something or other. I looked him up. Who appointed that guy? Well, unfortunately, or whatever. With only maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, and now we're getting 10, 20, 50, probably more than that, of these rulings. They're all coming from Obama and Biden judges, occasionally a Clinton judge. And so the charge that our courts have become political, there's certainly, it can be argued that way. If you know what a judge is going to rule, because of who appointed him, or let's put it differently. If you suspect when you see a ruling, if you suspect when a case goes before a judge, enjoining Trump or stopping him, President Trump, to do one thing or another, and you look it up and it's going before a federal judge who was appointed by President Obama or President Biden, and then you say, look out, these guys are going to come down, and that's politicizing our courts. And boy, we are really in a lot of trouble. And of course, you can argue that the Supreme Court itself is politicized, because you have 6 now of those who were appointed by the Republicans and 3 by Democrats. However, kind of a little unknown fact in the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court rules unanimously on the vast majority of the cases that come before it, but the press only takes interest in some that really grab their attention. So here we are. Everything is being politicized. Everything is being enjoined and so on. And there's a real question whether we can govern this way. And we'll have to see whether we can or not. But the apportionment that we're dealing with now is, I call it a mess. And it goes back to Baker versus Carr in 1962 and the Supreme Court wading into this. They were probably right to do so. I don't think so. I think they should have probably stayed out of it back in 1962 and let the voters of each of these states resolve this inequity, which voters and public generally do. It's how women got the right to vote. It's how we've knitted our country together as best we can on the racial issues and so on. It is that when the public finally has a moral moment, things get done. But it takes a little while to cure that and for that to come about. But our history on that one is really pretty good. And it suggests that had there been no Baker versus Carr back in 1962, then all of that would have been resolved quite a long time ago. And by the way, one other aspect of that is that Cuba was always thought in the early part of the 19th century to be going to become a part of the United States. It was low-hanging fruit, one person said. But like the United States, Cuba had slavery, they had sugar plantations and so on. So when the Civil War came along, it became clear, and the Civil War was over, and we had abolished slavery. Slavery continued to exist in Cuba, which meant that the chance that we would bring Cuba into the United States, which people wanted that to happen, both in Cuba and in the United States. So then Cuba was forced to kind of go its own way. But here's my point. Less than 20 years later, Cuba abolished slavery, by the way, without a civil war and so on. So let things sift into place, and sometimes, guess what? Things will sift into place. But if you want to hamper around in things, okay, you can make a not a good situation sometimes worse with a lot of unintended consequences. And I kind of suggest that's where we are on apportionment, reapportionment, and a whole lot of other issues in our country.